Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Jen, and I talk about true crime cases on this channel. Before we jump into this case, if you haven't already, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button, as well as hit the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of my future videos. So for this week's video, we're going to be covering part 2 of Brandon Embry's case. If you've not watched part 1 of this case, please be sure to do so first before watching this video, because everything will just make a lot more sense. Part 1 of that video did end with me sharing some information with you guys about a woman named Cassandra and how she had reached out to Brandon's sister-in-law to say that she and Brandon had been dating. When Cassandra reached out to Brandon's sister-in-law did forward the Facebook message that Cassandra sent her over to Sarah Lee, who is Brandon's mother. Sarah would end up reaching out to Cassandra, and this would begin a 10-month-long communication between Sarah and Cassandra. Sarah and Cassandra, during the period of time that they were in communication with each other, they would actually meet up in person a few times, maybe 3 or 4 times. And Sarah recalls one time, I think this was probably the first time that Sarah had met Cassandra in person. They met in Ashboro, and she remembers Cassandra having made a few really strange comments. Sarah also remembers Cassandra visibly shaking, like she was nervous about this encounter, like this meeting with Sarah. When they eventually sat down together and had a coffee and Cassandra settled in a little bit, Sarah mentions that Cassandra actually came off really strong during the conversation, and that she had supposedly stated to Sarah that Brandon and her were wildly and madly in love. Cassandra supposedly even said that Brandon was her soulmate. Cassandra also supposedly said that Brandon and her had plans to get married and that Brandon had purchased her a wedding ring. And she also supposedly showed Sarah like a picture on her phone of the ring that Brandon had supposedly purchased for her. Shockingly, she also supposedly told Sarah that she had at one point been pregnant with Brandon's child, but that she had miscarried. Cassandra really did not spare a single detail regarding her relationship with Brandon while speaking with Sarah. She even told Sarah about all of the pet names that she would call Brandon. She shared intimate details of their relationship with Sarah, and even told Sarah that they had opened a joint bank account together. Cassandra would then supposedly go on to say that she was entitled to the money that was in that joint bank account. Just a side note, again, because no one's been convicted yet for this case, I just want to remind you guys that I will be using the words supposedly and allegedly a lot throughout this video, because again, I don't want to get in any legal trouble because this case has been closed and no one's been charged for anything. So just keep that in mind and please bear with me. So now back again to Cassandra and Brandon's relationship. Sarah and her family had no idea that Brandon was dating this woman. The only mention of Cassandra to any of his family members was to Rachel in January or February of 2019, when Brandon had just met Cassandra and they had just started talking. From what Cassandra was telling Sarah, it really sounded like she and Brandon's relationship was very, very serious, but there was never any mention to anyone how serious their relationship was. I mean, Brandon never ever told anybody about how serious his relationship with Cassandra was. His family didn't even know that they were dating. If it was really as serious as Cassandra had made it sound to be, why didn't Brandon share any information with his family? Brandon was really close to his family. He had a great relationship with them, and he would often talk to them about his relationships, like his previous relationships. He's always shared information with his family, whether it's like Rachel or his stepdad or even Sarah. But while Cassandra and Brandon were communicating with each other, Brandon was also talking to another woman who is living in Virginia, and that woman is Olivia Doss. In fact, Brandon and Olivia were in contact with each other 5 times more than Brandon was with Cassandra. This leads Sarah and her family to believe that Cassandra may be lying about the extent of her relationship with Brandon. When the authorities found Cassandra's phone number in Brandon's phone records, they did reach out to her to ask where she was around the time that he had passed, or that he had been found. And Cassandra told them that she was sick and home alone in bed the whole time. Now, because Sarah had her suspicions about Cassandra, she did continue to put effort into maintaining that relationship with Cassandra for about 10 months, because she essentially wanted to find out as much information as she could from this woman and then share it with the authorities, or also use that information to try to figure out what happened to her son. Sarah also recalls that from that first face-to-face meeting that she had with Cassandra, when they were sitting down and talking about things, Sarah was a little taken aback by something that Cassandra said. Cassandra was telling Sarah a story about how she and Brandon had once gone into a Walmart, they had picked up a blender, and they had essentially forgotten to charge it during the self-checkout process. They ended up just not paying for it, and Cassandra said to Sarah it was as if they got away with murder. Sarah immediately becomes very uncomfortable and a little suspicious of Cassandra's choice of words. So again, throughout those 10 months, Sarah would put in a lot of effort to maintain her relationship with Cassandra. They would speak daily sometimes, either through Facebook Messenger, just texting back and forth. Sometimes they would speak on the phone, or they would meet up face to face. As time went on and the conversations between Sarah and Cassandra continued, the detectives would begin to take a closer look at Cassandra. At one point, the detectives would contact Cassandra again and would ask her to come in for questioning. They just wanted to speak with her about her relationship with Brandon and to just ask her a few questions in order to do their due diligence. Right after the detectives contacted Cassandra to ask her to come in, Cassandra calls Sarah and they have a 20-minute long conversation where Cassandra is just crying on the phone. She states to Sarah that she doesn't feel comfortable going in to speak about Brandon and that she's scared to talk to the detectives.
Oh God, I'm so stressed out now.
Well, I don't think you need to be stressed out. I think you shouldn't worry about it. You just wait until the time to talk to him and just go and talk about Brandon, because you may know something that's helpful for them to kind of come to a conclusion about why he died, and that's helping Brandon. That's helping Brandon have peace.
In the end, Cassandra would end up telling the detective that she wasn't feeling well and that she wasn't going to be going in. Now, this is a red flag to me, because why is this woman so scared to go in to talk to a few detectives about the man that she is so wildly in love with? It really makes you wonder what she was hiding. Eventually, the detectives were able to convince Cassandra to come into the station and to just speak with them, and she did end up going in on December 4th, where they would end up having a 2-hour-long session. Cassandra told the detectives that she lived in South Carolina and that she's only ever been in Asheboro maybe 4 or 5 times. The last time that she was in Asheboro was to visit Brandon for his birthday on September 7th. Again, Cassandra and Brandon met around the same time that Brandon immediately began to have all these struggles with his health. Brandon had to seek medical care around 4 or 5 times, and Cassandra had visited Brandon 4 or 5 times. I don't know. It's very suspicious to me. So after the 2-hour-long interview with the detectives, Detective Sudith would ask Cassandra if he could extract some data from her phone, to which she consented. The detective told Cassandra that the data extraction would need to be done at a different sheriff's department, and that he needed to leave the room to go and make that call and see if it could be done that day. When the detective leaves the room, he does notice that Cassandra quickly pulls out her phone to do something. But when he returned into the room, he would see that Cassandra had put her phone away back into her pocket. The detective would tell Cassandra to follow him in her car to the sheriff's department, which she did, and when they got there and they hooked her phone up, it turns out that there's no data available. Cassandra had no GPS data or text messages on her phone. It was as if all the data had been wiped off. Now, this is strange because earlier in the interview, the 2-hour-long session one that they had, Cassandra had shown the detectives text messages between her and Brandon, but now all of that was missing. So it's likely that Cassandra had deleted the text messages and information or had done a factory reset on her phone before giving her phone to the authorities to do the data extraction. The next day, Detective Sudith would reach out to Cassandra's carrier, I think it was Verizon, to ask them to preserve her phone records. And on the 20th of December, the detective would then also send a warrant to Verizon for Cassandra's phone records. Verizon apparently did comply, but Sarah was never provided a copy of the records. Sarah had apparently been trying to chase Detective Sudith on the phone records, and she was never able to reach him. This is how she finds out, actually, that Detective Sudith had been taken off the case and promoted to something else, and the new lead detective was Detective Johnson. So apparently right after the 2-hour-long interview session with the detectives, Cassandra would go home and she would call Sarah, and while she's on the phone with Sarah, she begins to laugh and she says to Sarah, "Is that it?" I think that that's a really weird thing to say. It's almost as if she's happy that she's gotten away with something. Throughout Sarah's conversations with Cassandra, Sarah would quickly come to the realization that most of what Cassandra was telling her was just untrue. Cassandra had told Brandon that she was from Russia when in reality she was from Farmingdale, Maine. Her parents and her grandparents were also from Farmingdale, Maine. She also told Sarah that she had suffered from lifelong stomach issues, as well as an eating disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, as well as multiple sclerosis. And Sarah does believe that this is untrue. She also told Sarah that she has a nursing degree, which turned out to not be true. She then also told Sarah that she had a twin sister who had passed, but again, untrue. She actually does have a sister, but not a twin, and she's very much alive. Cassandra even told Sarah that she has a brother, but again, does not have a brother, only one sister, and that sister is most certainly not dead. She then even goes on to tell Sarah that when she was 14 years old, she had a baby, and that baby had died. And here's when things get weirder. Cassandra tells Sarah and the detectives during her 2-hour-long session that she only found out about Brandon's death about a week after he had passed when she had visited his apartment. She was going there to check in on him because she hadn't heard from him in a while and she was getting worried. And when she got there, Brandon's neighbor came out and told her that Brandon had passed away. Cassandra also said that when she found out, she was completely devastated. She was so devastated that she almost passed out when receiving the news. Cassandra supposedly also told Sarah that when she found out about the news from the neighbor, she had yelled at the neighbor and told the neighbor that the neighbor was a liar. But when Sarah reached out to that same neighbor to ask if this was true, the neighbor would tell Sarah that Cassandra took the news just fine. When the neighbor told Cassandra what had happened, Cassandra supposedly had just stuck out her hand, shook the neighbor's hand, and said thank you. So this is a very different story to what Cassandra was telling Sarah. Cassandra told Sarah that she had gotten worried about Brandon when she was sending him tons of text messages and trying to call him, and he just wasn't being responsive. So she would show Sarah these messages to Brandon from her own phone. And you can see in her messages that she likes to add S's to her words because she told Sarah that, again, she's from Russia and English wasn't her first language. Again, another lie. But now for the biggest lie of all. Cassandra was married and was living with her husband in South Carolina. She was married and had a husband the whole time that she was supposedly dating Brandon. Cassandra was married to a man who we will call D, just for privacy purposes. She was fully married and still living with her husband around the time that she and Brandon were supposedly dating. D lives in Darlington, South Carolina, which is about a 2-hour-long drive away from Brandon's apartment. Cassandra and D apparently got married in 2012 when D was 42 years old and Cassandra Cassandra was 22. Apparently, Dee knew Cassandra's family when Cassandra was younger, but they didn't meet again until Cassandra was an adult, and that's when they would end up developing a relationship. Cassandra was living in a nearby town to Dee around the time that they had met up again when she was an adult, and she apparently moved in with him the same month that they met, and she just never left. The two would end up getting married in February of 2012, 2 or 3 months after they met again, and Cassandra would end up keeping the marriage a secret from her family until December 2013. She apparently had Dee fake a proposal in front of her family during a trip to Maine, and he just went along with it. Dee said that things in their marriage seemed fine for the first few years, but then it started getting weird in 2019. Cassandra and Dee would start sleeping in 2 separate bedrooms, and Cassandra would disappear on trips, sometimes for a night and sometimes for weeks or months. She would tell Dee that she was going away for work in Virginia or Colorado or Maine, but he was never really sure where she was. Cassandra would regularly purchase new prepaid phones, and she would use those phones in addition to her main phone. I get having multiple phones, but having to constantly buy new prepaid phones, I'm not sure why you would need to do that, unless you were hiding something. When Cassandra would leave for her trips, she would tell Dee that it's because she needs to go somewhere for work. This is strange because Dee actually says that Cassandra was mainly unemployed. She sometimes would work at this IHOP or at an inn, but not consistently or regularly, so he actually was providing her with financial support. Dee had a checking account that he had opened for Cassandra, and he would just deposit money into that every month. Dee did state that eventually he did have his suspicions about her maybe being on sugar daddy websites, and that maybe she had somebody else that was supporting her through different types of work. Now you're probably wondering, how do we know all this information about Dee? Well, Dee actually shared all of this information with Sarah directly because he's in support of Sarah's investigation. Sarah connected with Dee about a year after Brandon's passing because a friend of Sarah's reached out to Dee, I think maybe on Facebook. That friend had introduced Dee to Sarah. Dee told Sarah that he had actually found 2 burner phones that were left in his home by Cassandra after Cassandra had moved out. He went through those burner phones, took photos of them, of the messages in the phones as well, and then sent them to Sarah. He also sent to Sarah all of his own communications, all of his own text messages with Cassandra. Dee would tell Sarah that when Cassandra wasn't traveling and she was home with him, he would become very ill very often. Whenever she would leave to go on her trips or wherever she was going, he would miraculously feel better. Dee recalls feeling very fatigued and very weak, so similar symptoms to Brandon. When Dee hears about what happened to Brandon and all of the health scares that Brandon had encountered in 2019 before he had passed, he tells Sarah that it just makes so much sense now why he always felt so ill when he was with Cassandra. So back when Dee and Cassandra were still married and living together, Dee would wake up every morning and he would make himself a pot of coffee in which he would put into a to-go cup to take to work. After he would make that coffee, he would jump into the shower and get ready for work, and then he would just leave for work with the coffee. Every time he finished drinking that coffee, he would feel immediately nauseated and just exhausted throughout the whole day. And now some of you might be thinking that maybe he just had some bad side effects from coffee because everybody reacts to caffeine differently. But when Cassandra wasn't around and he would make his coffee and he would go to work and he would drink his coffee, he would feel fine. And this would go on for a really long time, and Dee just really couldn't figure out what was going on with his health. I think he also did go to the doctors at some point as well, and they also couldn't figure out what was going on with him.
And see, that sends chills up my spine because the doctors could never pinpoint what was causing my illnesses. I went down as muscle tone, weakness, just fatigued, and tired all the time.
But during his conversations with Sarah about what had happened with Brandon and everything that Brandon went through, it was as if a light bulb had just gone off in his head. Sarah would continue to do some more research on Cassandra, and this research would lead her to finding Cassandra's ex-boyfriend, who we will call A. Sarah reached out to A, and he was also able to share some more information with her about Cassandra. A had apparently dated Cassandra for 3 years and lives in Maine. And the story that he would share with Sarah would be very similar to that of Brandon and Dee's. One incident that struck out to him was when Cassandra had handed him a vitamin water with an already open top. He would drink from the bottle and would immediately feel very nauseated. He became so sick that he would just begin vomiting. A says that to this day he will not drink anything from a bottle that's been already opened and handed to him by somebody else, because that incident really just caused him to not trust people. And again, the illnesses that D and A had experienced while with Cassandra is really important to note, because Brandon also experienced a lot of health issues when he was with Cassandra himself. His health issues again would begin in February 2019, around the time when he and Cassandra would supposedly begin dating, and it would start with abdominal pain and vomiting and would just become more severe. So severe that he had to be taken to the ER and had to seek out medical assistance several times. And let's not forget that Brandon was admitted into the ICU in February 2019 because of how ill he was and because of his kidneys and livers failing. Brandon had nearly died from that medical incident, and no one had been able to explain to him or his family why his kidney and liver were failing. They ran tests, but again, they couldn't figure out what was going on with him. So in addition to the suspected poisoning, D and A would tell Sarah that Cassandra had supposedly told them a bunch of lies as well. She had supposedly lied to both men about where she was from and that she had kids before, but they had passed. And at one point, she'd even told A that she was pregnant with his child, but then miscarried twice. Both D and A would eventually become accustomed to Cassandra's lies, and whenever she would just tell them anything, they would just be like, oh, okay, well, it's probably not true anyways. A said that Cassandra also had a bad habit of using people's phones to pretend that she was them. She had supposedly on multiple occasions taken A's phone to text his family members pretending to be him, or would text or call other guys using his phone and would send them provocative photos or messages, and when he would see this, she would deny that it was her. The breaking point in Cassandra and A's relationship was when Cassandra had supposedly called A's bank and told the bank that she and A were married, and she did this because she was trying to get into his finances. She ended up stealing about $2,500 from A, and when he found out about this, he told her that he was going to call the cops, but by that time she up and left town, and he's not heard from her since. There were other incidents that A had also shared with Sarah. One was when Cassandra allegedly pulled a gun on him, and then just other times where he would get really, really ill after Cassandra had supposedly made him dinner and given him some food, and yeah, he would eat the food and just become really, really sick. Hey guys, sorry, I had to film this video on 2 different days because when I was filming yesterday, my battery died and then it was just getting too late. So I am filming this video, the rest of it, today, which is why I am wearing a completely different outfit. So let's continue on with the rest of the case. Despite the fact that what most of the things that Cassandra was telling people in her life were lies, Sarah did believe that there could be some truths found in Cassandra's lies. For example, about a month after Brandon's passing, Cassandra would text D to tell him that it was Brandon's 1-month death anniversary. However, when referring to Brandon in the message, she would actually use the name Sean. And the text that Cassandra sent to D would read, "It's almost Sean's 1-month death anniversary. His mom stopped by and gave Ariel a sweatshirt, me a shirt and shorts, and Louise a shirt, pants, sweatshirt, and photos." As you can see in the the screenshot of the text message that I've included in this video, Cassandra would refer to 2 other women, Louise and Ariel. Sarah does have her suspicions that Louise may actually be a code name or a fake name for Olivia Doss. However, it's unclear who Ariel could be. Now let's talk a little bit about Olivia Doss and the potential part that she maybe could have played in Brandon's death. When I spoke with Sarah, Sarah told me that she and Olivia actually spoke earlier on during the investigation. Sarah had followed Olivia on Instagram and the 2 of them would have a few short chats. Olivia was also interviewed by the detectives, but they didn't find her to be a suspect. However, Sarah does have her suspicions that Olivia may have been involved in what happened to Brandon. Sarah mentioned that during one of her chats with Olivia, Olivia would tell Sarah that Brandon was taking Benadryl for his allergies and that right up until his death, or like right before his death, he, quote, sounded like a snot rocket. However, Sarah thought that that was strange because she doesn't remember Brandon having issues with his allergies, and she had actually seen Brandon around that time period that Olivia was talking about, and Brandon sounded fine. Sarah also said that Olivia had told her that Olivia and Brandon had only met once, but for whatever reason, Olivia happened to have one of his shirts. This left Sarah wondering why a woman who's only met her son once would have taken and kept one of his clothing items. During one of their conversations, Olivia also supposedly asked Sarah if Brandon was cremated, but never once asked about a funeral service. I do find that that's a weird thing to ask somebody. Like, why, out of all the things that you could have asked, why would you ask if they're cremated? It's such a specific question. Olivia and Sarah's communications wouldn't go on for too long. They just stopped speaking to one another via Instagram, and then Olivia also deleted her Facebook. Now, when Sarah did a search into Olivia, she did find that Olivia had a Facebook friend named Jenna who had supposedly died of a suicide just days after Brandon's passing. Sarah had found out about Jenna because Jenna had tagged Olivia in a number of posts and photos, and it looked like the 2 of them were friends. When Sarah found out about Jenna's death, Sarah would reach out to one of Jenna's other friends. That friend would tell Sarah that she suspected that somebody had been in Jenna's house before she died. Jenna's home was found in a huge mess, which was similar to Brandon's apartment. And apparently, right before Jenna's death, she was unexpectedly admitted into a North Carolina hospital for similar symptoms to Brandon's. Sarah would also find out that Olivia had lied to her about a few things that she had shared with Sarah. For example, Olivia had supposedly told Sarah that her mother was a retired nurse, but when Sarah looked into it, she found out that Olivia's mother was actually working at a furniture store in Roanoke. So Sarah suspects that Olivia's mom was never a nurse. At one point during their chats, Sarah would ask Olivia if she had any photos of Brandon that she could share with Sarah. She told Olivia that while she had her own photos of her son did seem to have this whole social life that she wasn't aware of. So she just wanted to know if Olivia had any of her own photos with Brandon or of Brandon that she could share with Sarah. But Olivia would tell Sarah that she had just recently gotten a new phone and she didn't back up her data and all her photos and whatnot, so she unfortunately didn't have any photos of Brandon anymore. Now, Sarah would also ask the same thing of Cassandra, and Cassandra would tell her a very similar story. Cassandra would tell Sarah that she didn't have any photos of Brandon either because she had just gotten a new phone and she didn't have the photos anymore. Now, on Tuesday the 10th of September, Olivia Doss would be Brandon's last phone call, according to his phone records. When Sarah asked Olivia, like, what did you and Brandon speak about? Olivia would tell Sarah that she didn't remember. And remember that Tuesday, Sarah had tried to call Brandon multiple times, but he never got back to her. She did find it really strange that Brandon didn't pick up any of her calls or reply to her messages, but yet had a 13-minute conversation with Olivia on the phone. Cassandra and Olivia did tell Sarah that they didn't have any communications with Brandon on the 11th or 12th of September. Cassandra claims that she was sick in bed the whole time with a MS flare-up, and Olivia had told Sarah that she and Brandon weren't speaking because Brandon was really upset with her about something. Apparently, Olivia was meant to meet with Brandon for his birthday, but she didn't so this left Brandon really angry at her. I find it very strange that both women just happened to both change their phones, both lost all photos that they had of Brandon, and then also both women happened to not be speaking with Brandon during the few days that he was unconscious in his apartment. They claim that they did not send any texts or called Brandon at all during those few days. However, Cassandra would send a few dramatic text messages to Brandon's phone on Friday the 13th. You can see in the text messages that she's threatening Brandon with a wellness check, but yet she doesn't try to call him on the phone, and she doesn't drive up to check in on him until days later, almost a week later. And remember, this man is supposedly the love of her life, her soulmate, and her future husband. Also, Cassandra told Sarah that she was meant to go and see Brandon for his birthday, which is confusing because on one hand, we have Olivia who is saying she was meant to meet up with Brandon, but then on the other, we have Cassandra who says that she was supposed to go and see Brandon. So was Brandon meeting with both women on that evening, or what's going on? I don't know. Cassandra tells Sarah that she had arrived at Brandon's apartment on the night of his birthday because they had plans together, but he ended up never answering her knock at the door. She also apparently waited for him in the parking lot for 2 hours, but couldn't get a hold of him, so she eventually left. Now, there's also one other thing that was really strange to me, or really stood out to me. Cassandra had apparently told Sarah that she and Brandon's phones were linked together. Their phones would somehow delete things off of each other's phones. Now, I'm not a super techie person. I really don't understand how that would work. They were both using two separate devices, two separate accounts, and on different carriers. So how would Brandon's phone be able to delete things automatically off of her phone and vice versa? If anyone has the answer to that, please let me know in the comments because I'm genuinely curious about how that would even work. Now, another thing to note here is that after Cassandra's 2-hour-long session with the detectives, she would text her husband D and tell him that the detectives had asked her if she was jealous of the other woman that Brandon had been seeing. And in the message to D, she would basically tell him like, no way she would be jealous of Louise. They were best friends. As a reminder, Sarah does suspect that Louise is actually Olivia Doss, but the detectives never considered the possibility that the two women could have been working together. Sarah believes that Cassandra was using the names of real people that she knew in her life to cover for other people. It's very confusing. Try to stick with me here. I'm trying to also wrap my head around it. Apparently, Cassandra did actually know two people named Louise and Sean from the IHOP that she was working at. The Louise and the Sean from the IHOP were her colleagues, but they had nothing to do with Brandon. They didn't know Brandon, Brandon didn't know them, and they had never met. So this leads Sarah to believe that Cassandra may be using people's names, like cycling people's names to kind of hide who she's really talking about. Again, I have no idea what to make of all of this. I know just how bizarre and crazy it all sounds. Sarah and Cassandra's husband D did meet in October of 2019. I think they met up for coffee, and this is when D would show Sarah all of his messages with Cassandra. That same month, in October 2019, Cassandra would supposedly text her husband D and tell him that she was very ill and that she had been admitted into the hospital because of her sickness, but that wasn't true. She was actually with Sarah. And in December, Cassandra calls Sarah and tells her that she had a dream of Brandon's death scene. And she would tell Sarah that when she saw Brandon in her dream, he was laying naked on the floor of his apartment. And what she was describing was very eerily similar to what actually happened. Cassandra would also ask Sarah about Brandon's dog tags. She had told Sarah that the dog tags were super important to Brandon and basically begged them to make sure that they were found. And what's interesting is that around the time of Brandon's death, Dee actually recalls seeing dog tags laying on Cassandra's bed. In addition to that, he also recalls Cassandra having all these bruises on her legs right after she brought the dog tags home, and he even remembers that she was wearing shorts, basketball shorts, that looked like they were Brandon's. The reason that Dee even remembers this is because he found it really strange that Cassandra would be wearing men's basketball shorts. He also said that she was wearing these shorts right after she brought home the dog tags, and he had never seen them before. He is sure that he's never seen them before because he's the one who does their laundry in the house, and that was the first time he's ever seen them. And in one of their many conversations, Dee would also tell Sarah that Cassandra would regularly ask him to purchase bottles of sleeping pills from Walmart. She would supposedly go through so many bottles in such a short period that Dee would find himself going to Walmart multiple times throughout the week just to buy her these bottles.
Or I would buy at least 2 100 pill bottles of sleeping pills, Walmart Equate brand, because they were like $10 a pop, and that was $20. And I would buy those a lot, maybe $100 worth a month.
And this is interesting because Brandon's toxicology report did come back positive with an ingredient that is present in those pills. That ingredient is called diphenhydramide. After Cassandra had moved out of Dee's home and he was cleaning up his home, he did find a few capsules just laying around that had been emptied out. Empty capsules were also found in Brandon's apartment. Not only were emptied capsules found in Brandon's room, a bottle of sleeping pills were also found in his room, and they were the same exact brand from Walmart. And in one of Sarah's conversations with Cassandra, Cassandra supposedly suggested that maybe Brandon had committed suicide by taking sleeping pills. Sarah did share a recording of a phone call with Dee where they would discuss how Cassandra had shared information with Sarah that she would have only known if she had been at the scene at the time. Brandon's family had not been speaking with the media about Brandon's case. At that point, the authorities were still trying to figure out what happened, and the investigation was still open, so all that information was not made public.
She couldn't have known what she said unless she had been there, because none of that had been released. Then
I mean, I haven't watched all of it. The way she talked is like what you said. She was there, or it sounded like she was there. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, she described...
I am so sorry.
Thank you.
I mean, I am so sorry for you, but I don't know. I can't answer for the things if she did that. But
Right.
It's got me upset because I'm married to this woman.
You can also hear in the recording that Dee would express his surprise to hear that so many of the things found in Brandon's apartment were actually things that he had in his own house when Cassandra was living there. For example, the same brand of sleeping medications as well as cleaning supplies, all from the same place, which is Walmart.
Yeah, but what got me thinking is how much of her stuff that was up there actually came from this house. You know, like the spray bottles. That's a common spray bottle from Walmart. They could have been under my kitchen sink.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
What
Right.
did she take from here and go up there with? And that was 2 years ago.
In the recording, Dee also mentions to Sarah that when he had first gotten together with Cassandra, he was still sharing custody of his son, who we will, just for privacy reasons, call Jay. And Jay is Dee's son from a previous marriage. And whenever Jay would spend time at his father's house, he would complain often of feeling very sick. He felt very fatigued and complained of stomach pains. Sarah and Dee would also talk about the fact that Jay was Dee's beneficiary for his insurance, and that Cassandra had at one point asked Dee about this. Cassandra had apparently asked Dee who his beneficiary was, and Dee would tell her, "Oh, it's my son Jay." And Cassandra was not happy about this. She went off on Dee and told him that as his wife, she should be made his beneficiary.
She asked me about beneficiaries, and I said, well, I got my son as a beneficiary. And she was always kind of, well, I'm your wife, this and that.
Now, with all this information that we know now, it really does make you wonder whether Cassandra had anything to do with Jay feeling so sick every time he was at his father's house. Now, from what I've read, it seems like Brandon was not the only person that Cassandra was cheating on Dee with. Dee had found multiple letters from inmates that Cassandra was supposedly corresponding with while they were still living together. And the contents of the letters were definitely not platonic. She even apparently visited these two inmates at the prison, and when she would go, she would just tell Dee that she was visiting her dad who was in jail, but in fact her father was not in jail. One of the inmates also supposedly sent Cassandra a sketch with his letter that represented a bearded and muscular man that resembled Brandon. And then in the same sketch, he had also drawn a woman with a bottle of sleeping pills as well as a adult toy that looked very similar to one that Brandon had in his apartment. Now, I don't really know what to make of all of that, but it does look very suspicious. After Cassandra had moved out, Dee would find a letter from the prison, which is actually in Maine, and that letter had basically stated that Cassandra had a 90-day visitation ban from the prison. The letter didn't state the reason why she had been banned, but Dee was very shocked and confused about all this information that he had just found out about his wife. Now, back to the investigation. In 2020, Sarah would start to encounter a lot of challenges with the Ashboro Police Department. Again, earlier in the investigation, I did mention that there were theories floating around that Brandon had been abusing drugs and maybe had died because of this. Detective Johnson had told Sarah that they had found synthetic MJ in Brandon's apartment, but again, this was never logged. And when Sarah asked them, why was this not logged if you think it had anything to do with the case, they stated that there was no clear reason. And when Sarah spoke to one of Brandon's exes, that ex told Sarah that there's no way that Brandon would have touched synthetic MJ. It wasn't his. Brandon had studied chemical pre-engineering and he understood the dangerous potential side effects of synthetic MJ, so he refused to touch it. His sister Rachel even recalls a time when they were at a house gathering with other people and somebody had synthetic MJ. Brandon told them like, hey, can you just smoke this somewhere else? I don't feel comfortable breathing in that secondhand smoke. When speaking with Sarah, Sarah strongly believes that Detective Johnson was lying about what was found in his apartment. She believes that there was no synthetic MJ and that Detective Johnson had just made this all up. And even if synthetic MJ had actually been present in his apartment, Sarah is adamant that it must have belonged to somebody else who had been to his apartment prior to his death. Sarah also says that Detective Johnson had apparently told the ME of Brandon's autopsy that Brandon had taken synthetic MJ, and then this led the ME to essentially allude to this in the autopsy report. The ME alluded in the autopsy report that Brandon could have taken something, but that it had just gone out of his system. When Sarah spoke to a forensic pathologist who reviews autopsies, that forensic pathologist told Sarah that the ME should have never added that into the report because the report, the official report, should only include facts, not speculation. This leads Sarah to believe that there may have been collusion and the falsifying of information between the ME and Detective Johnson. I will now share a recording of Sarah's conversation with the authorities about her concerns with Detective Johnson and the supposed synthetic MJ.
You say here that Detective Lori Johnson had evidence destroyed, physical and biological evidence containing DNA on a case she closed with falsified evidence and a fabricated event, non-existent drugs fictitiously taken by my son. So tell me a little bit about the destruction of evidence that you're talking about here.
She closed the
please.
case, which was actually, this makes 1 year. I was here at the police department February 27th of 2020. And she closed the case. There was an SBI agent present, which I would like to get his name. The next day I called because I wanted everything. I wanted all of the evidence so that I could independently pursue having a forensics done on what was found.
Mm-hmm.
She told me that she would have to check with the detective to see what I could have back, but she never said that anything would be destroyed.
Okay.
I was given a few things back, which will say on the evidence log of what is disposed is what came back to me, and then everything else was destroyed. And she knew that this synthetic marijuana didn't exist. There is no synthetic marijuana. I have, again, the search warrants, the evidence log, and the crime scene photos. There is no synthetic marijuana.
Yeah, I'm just not
Go ahead.
familiar with the case either. I wonder if there's anything on there, because sometimes, like on bias narcotics, sometimes we'll take items of evidence not knowing at the time what it is until it's tested. Again, I no preconceived notions. I don't know enough about the case, but I know sometimes when we do the search warrant inventory, we don't know what the item is until later on when we're actually able to determine. So I don't know if that.
But they would have to write everything down that they take, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is nothing.
Nothing that would indicate it's
No.
something that could be like that.
No. And if there's a test that exists, it looks like they would have told me, hey, we, sent this off
Okay.
and got it proven, because that's what I've been asking for all along. I want the proof.
Okay.
I want some forensics. I want some evidence. I want a photograph. And it is, this is...
So did Detective Johnson, was she theorizing that there might have been some synthetic marijuana, or did she flatly tell you that we seized?
She said, we found synthetic marijuana in his apartment.
Okay.
And that's when I told her, if you did, it didn't belong to Brandon. It would have belonged to probably one of those females.
Sarah also shared with me that earlier on in the investigation, Detective Johnson had been the one to tell the ME that Brandon was taking serious hard drugs and that he had inflicted all these wounds onto himself. However, Detective Johnson had neglected to tell the ME that Brandon's apartment key was still missing and that he had been seen arguing with a man outside of his apartment just days before he was found. I just want to remind everybody that there were no illegal drugs found in Brandon's system when he was admitted into the hospital in September 2019. Illegal drugs were also not found in any of the numerous tests that he had taken earlier on in 2019 due to medical or employment reasons. Brandon was very adamant about not partaking in illegal drugs. He would only do chewing tobacco and drink from time to time. Brandon did have some alcohol bottles at home, but they were mostly full, and his family and friends stated that Brandon was not a huge drinker. Now, authorities did find a kratom powder packet in Brandon's apartment, but it's good to note that kratom is just an herbal substance and it's legal in North Carolina. It's unclear to me whether this belonged to Brandon or if it was somebody else's that had been left at his apartment. And again, I think I mentioned this in part 1, but authorities did find hypodermic needles in Brandon's apartment, which led the authorities to believe that he was abusing steroids. However, just as another reminder, Brandon did have a prescription for hormones to treat his low testosterone levels, and that this prescription was being overseen by a doctor. Despite this fact, Sarah does believe that this did have a negative impact on Brandon's case. Now, when it came time for Sarah to decide what she wanted to do with Brandon's body, she would decide to go ahead with a cremation. Before making this decision, she did consult the detective. She was given reassurance that no matter what the cause of death turned out to be, it wouldn't have any impact on the investigation. Sadly, this would turn out to not be the case. On October 21st, 2021, a supervisor from the police department named Major J. Hansen would provide his conclusions for the case, and the case would be closed. Although he did tell Sarah that if she was able to bring to him any additional credible information, that they could consider reopening the case. Now, this was really devastating to Sarah because she had just cremated her son. There would be no second chance to get a second opinion from his body for a new investigation. And then there was the fact that in March of 2020, Detective Johnson had approved for all forensic evidence relating to Brandon's case to be destroyed. Earlier in 2020, Sarah did hire a private forensic investigator because she wanted to essentially test all of the evidence outside of the police department, but she learned that this would not be possible. They destroyed all forensic evidence collected from Brandon's apartment. This also included his fingernail clippings, which may have contained important DNA. Remember, Brandon had scratch marks on him, which indicates that he may have been in very close contact with somebody, so there could have been important DNA under his fingernails. And after the authorities closed Brandon's case, Sarah said that they were really reluctant to share any of their records with her. She had to file an FOIA request and even contacted different agencies and attorneys because in early 2020, they would hand off some of their records to her, but not all. But eventually she did end up getting most of the records that she had requested from them. Sarah was rightly very upset by how this case had been handled. And in the conclusion of the review of Brandon's case, Major J. Hansen would provide the following statement. There is no evidence of forced entry, no evidence of theft or burglary, and no concrete motive for someone to have committed a homicide. Based upon the totality of the evidence reviewed, I concur with the medical examiner's opinion that his death is not a homicide. Sarah and her family do not agree with this statement. When the medical report was shared with Sarah in 2020, early 2020, she would review the report and would come to the belief that her son had been poisoned. He had ethyl glycol in his system, which is essentially antifreeze. And antifreeze was actually found in his apartment. And this leads Sarah to believe that antifreeze poisoning may have played a big part in Brandon getting so spontaneously sick throughout all of 2019. Sarah was furious about how Detective Johnson had handled her son's case. She did file a complaint against Detective Johnson to the police department, which then led to a internal affairs investigation. But the investigation really led nowhere. I'm going to be sharing a recording of the conversation that Sarah had with Major J. Hansen regarding the complaints that she filed against Detective Johnson.
Well, again, the whole idea here is that neither of us have been involved in this case from day one. And so, obviously, based on the nature of these allegations, the chief doesn't want somebody investigating this incident. And again, our focus here isn't so much on investigating the case all over again. It's investigating the allegations against Detective Johnson, because again,
Correct.
This is an administrative investigation to determine if there were any policies or laws violated by one of our officers.
You can hear in the recording that Major Hansen is saying the chief doesn't want this incident to be reinvestigated, and he states that the focus of this conversation is not to investigate the case all over again, but to investigate the allegations against Detective Johnson. And the allegations against Detective Johnson are potentially falsifying evidence as well as colluding with the medical examiner to cover up a homicide. Major Hansen told Sarah that this internal review was only for the complaints against Detective Johnson and not for the review of Brandon's case. Now, what's frustrating is that when Sarah receives the managerial review report, she notes that none of her concerns that she had shared with Major Hansen were ever investigated. Currently, Sarah is still trying to find out more information and is still trying to essentially piece together the puzzle of what happened to her son. Sarah does now have Brandon's phone and laptop, but she hasn't been able to access either devices because they are password encrypted, and the police have also refused to share with Sarah a copy of Brandon's phone records. They essentially refused to provide her with a valid reason and told her that they had given her everything that they had and that was it. Sarah and Cassandra no longer communicate with one another. Their relationship essentially ended when Sarah decided to go public with Brandon's case and with all the information that she has. Now, the last time that Sarah's met with Cassandra was on June 27th of 2020 at a Chili's in Ashboro. I believe that that's the last communication they've had with one another. However, in July of 2022, Cassandra's mother did reach out to Sarah to threaten a lawsuit against her. Sarah says that during that call, she actually did hear Cassandra in the background, but she hasn't spoken to Cassandra and no longer has a reachable phone number for Cassandra. Sarah started a Facebook page for Brandon, which I did share in the description of my last video and which I will also also share in the description of this video. That page has a lot of updated information which is shared directly by Sarah. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the case, please make sure to go check out that page. She does update the page very regularly with photos, screenshots, reports. So there's a lot of really interesting information there. Regarding what's next, Sarah is planning to file a wrongful death suit against Cassandra once she has enough evidence to support it. If a judge does grant her approval for this, Sarah will be able to essentially subpoena records, depose witnesses. This could really allow her the opportunity to fill in the gaps of information that she's missing. Now, Sarah has also set up a GoFundMe, which I have linked into this video. She is hoping to receive some support in order to continue with this investigation. The money will be going towards private investigators, forensic hacking, so that she can finally access Brandon's phone and laptop, as well as lawyers and medical expert opinions and other legal fees. She's been working on this for over 3 years now, and she doesn't have any plans to stop until she finds the information that she's looking for. After going through all of the information that's been shared with me, such as the messages, the photos, the records, the reports, everything, I don't believe that he inflicted these wounds on himself, and I don't believe that he died because he took illegal drugs. Something horrible happened to him in that apartment, and I think somebody else was involved in his death. The blow to the back of his neck, cuts, the scratches and bruising, it's really far-fetched to think that all of that could have been self-inflicted. I mean, Brandon had what looked like defensive stab wounds on his palms. I can't imagine him doing that to himself. I'm honestly really amazed by all of the work that Sarah has put into this investigation. She's just one woman that's been tirelessly working to gather all of this information by herself and just trying to make sense of it all on her own. And I really do hope that Sarah will be able to uncover the truth of what happened to her son. If you're still watching this video, I just want to say thank you so much. I know it's a very long video containing a lot of information, so I just want to thank you if you've watched part 1 and part 2. My goal here is to help spread awareness for Brandon's case. If you or anyone you know have any sort of information that could help with Brandon's case, please reach out. Again, I have linked Brandon's Facebook page in the description of this video. I have also linked the GoFundMe page that Sarah has created in case you want to support her in her mission for justice. And please share in the comments what you think really happened to Brandon Embry. Do you think Cassandra and Olivia know more than what they're letting on? Or do you think something else may have happened to Brandon? Thank you again for all of your support on my channel and for watching this video, and I really look forward to hearing what you guys think in the comments below.